Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show, putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Wednesday, October 7th, 2015, middle of the weekday, hump day, starting that long, slow glide down to Kaahumanu Friday and another weekend. And we have lots to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, the White House appears to be in full distract mode. We're at the top of the hour, and the Fox News story for the top of the hour is how Obama is having this big confab at the White House for union leaders and how we've got to strengthen unions and labor laws. And in all probability, this has a lot to do with the fact that the labor unions seem to be abandoning the Democratic Party. They're certainly abandoning Hillary Clinton, and they're gazing avariciously over at Donald Trump. So Obama's out there trying to bring them back into the fold. And I want to comment on something we heard on the news break just before we started our program, where Ashton Carter is out there saying, well, we have not agreed to cooperate with Russia in Syria. It's not up to him anymore. That's the part they don't want you to realize. The U.S. got trapped and defeated by their own propaganda that they were in Syria to get ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and Russia now has the initiative. Russia has been invited into Syria by the Syrian government. The U.S. is not supposed to be there. And they're trying to figure some way they can spin this to where the American people are going to say, oh, yes, it's okay for the U.S. government to go into other people's countries and change the government. And no, it isn't. It's a violation of international law and the UN Charter. Now, Russia is really uncorking on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and let's be honest, Russia is saying they are going after all of the terrorist groups trying to oust Bashar al-Assad. That's ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and all of them. And the U.S. is saying, you can't go after our friendly terrorist groups. You have no idea how much money we spent to create those in the first place. Russian warships fired 26 cruise missiles on ISIS targets in Syria from the Caspian Sea. And they followed a very convoluted path to get there. Once again, Russia is demonstrating their technology, and they're able to hit their targets from that far away. Now, here's a very misleading headline. Remember, the corporate media understands the vast majority of people will read the headline and ignore the rest of the story and think they're informed. And so very often it is the headlines where most of the spin is taking place. So over at the Times in Great Britain, Putin raises Syria stakes with threat to NATO jets. And if you stop reading at that point, you're left with the impression that Putin went out there and said, I am threatening the NATO jets, I will shoot them down, I will do bad things. And that's not what happened. Basically, Russia has deployed to Syria one of their new electronic warfare systems, the Krasnuha 4. And this appears to be a variant on the system that was used to paralyze the USS Donald Cook up in the Black Sea. Basically, it renders the electronics package on warplanes inoperative, blind, and has a range of 300 kilometers. And so basically what Russia is doing is saying NATO planes can't come in. They'll just quit working. But they're trying to spin the headline as if somehow Russia is attacking NATO's planes. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been joined by Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, calling for a coalition to combat terrorism in the Middle East. And we're starting to see all these puppet governments start to strain at the leash, where they're starting to say, you know, this might not be a bad idea to get rid of all these terrorists, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more. So Egypt's now on board. Iraq is asking them to come on in. Afghanistan's asking Russia to come on in. The whole grand plan for the dollarification of the Middle East oil fields, the revival of the petrodollar deal, it's crumbling to dust. And the U.S. doesn't know what to do. And they're in a panic, and they are desperate, And that, of course, makes them dangerous. Desperate people will take desperate steps. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. Now, French President Francois Hollande is sort of waffling back and forth on just which side of this debate he's on, because originally he was with NATO and the U.S., Assad must go, then all of a sudden France and Germany kind of like moved over toward Russia and said, yeah, maybe let's just get rid of all the terrorists and see what happens. But apparently Hollande had his leash jerked, and now he's back to saying that Assad must go and be replaced by his political opposition before anything can be accomplished. The only problem with that, there actually isn't any political opposition. It's Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian people on one side and the hired mercenaries trying to overthrow him on the other. And by the way, they just had an election in Syria. Bashar al-Assad won with 88.7% of the vote. Even with all the massive election fraud we see here in the United States of America, I don't remember any president of the United States being elected with a majority of 88.7%. And I think we can conclude that if Assad got 88.7% of the Syrian vote, then the people protesting his rule are not Syrian voters. It's another reminder. These are all people from the outside. Now, the Syrian army, encouraged by the success of the Russian airstrikes, has launched a ground offensive, and they're going into Hama and Idlib and routing ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the other U.S.-backed terrorist groups from there. Meanwhile, Putin has sent a Spetsnaz team after the leaders of ISIS, and these are the very best that Russia has. It's a very intense training program. It's like the American Rangers or the Green Beret. Now, Russia, once again, is out there trying to basically look like they're statesmen and cooperating with everybody. They have again offered to share their knowledge of the ISIS targets with the U.S., and they're getting no response. And we know why. The U.S. doesn't want to bomb ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They've had a year to do it, and they haven't done it. The U.S. is stuck. They're trapped by their own propaganda here, and they're trying to find some way. I mean, it's right out of George Orwell's 1984. We've always been at war with ISIS. No. ISIS is now our friends. We've always been at war with Bashar al-Assad. It's amazing how prescient George Orwell was. I mean, we're there, where the government is switching enemies and friends back and forth. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are the bad guys. No, over in Syria, they're the good guys, and over here, they're the bad guys. Right out of 1984. Right out of 1984. Now, there's another story that's percolating all over the corporate media. And I think typical of the spin is the way Fox News handled it. Russian jets intercept U.S. Predator drones over Syria, officials say. And again, if you look at the headline and go no further, it sounds like the Russian jets shot down the Predator drones. No. To intercept merely means that your plane and their plane are in the same part of the sky together. And the Russian planes merely followed the U.S. Predator drones over Syria, basically to let them know that they were there. And again, Russian fighters have legal permission from the Syria government to be in the skies over Syria. U.S. Predator drones do not. Basically, it was Russia demonstrating that those Predator drones are not as stealthy as the U.S. thought they might be. Meanwhile, the Syrian rebels are asking the U.S. government for arms to defend against the Russian strikes. More of your tax dollars at work. Obama has already authorized the resupply. They're saying the weapons are probably going to be funneled in through Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So I guess this makes the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia state sponsors of terror. That was supposed to be a bad thing. We'll be right back. Hello, hi, America. Welcome back to our show. And as we mentioned last segment, we're seeing the propaganda spin cycle on absolute overdrive right now. Trying to get us all to say, yes, it's okay for the U.S. to go into other countries and kick out their government and replace them, which it's not under international law, and how Russia's interfering with the U.S. going into other countries and kicking out the government somehow represents Russian aggression, which is absolute nonsense. The U.S. is the aggressor in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya, all over, and Ukraine. And so we're seeing more of this ramping up of Russia's bad, Russia's evil, Russia's coming to steal cookies out of your cookie jar, Russia's coming to, you know, tinker with the emissions controls on your diesel engines, whatever. So over in foreign policy, journalist, and I use the term very loosely, Paul McCleary, warned of the threat of the Russian army invading northeastern Poland to connect Russia with the exclave of Kaliningrad, thus cutting off the Baltic states from NATO. Of course, going back to the wisdom to find out if you're being lied to, look for what should be there and isn't. And what isn't there is a motive, a reason for Russia to do something that stupid when Russia's track record to date has been to try and keep the situation tamped down. Remember the chemical weapons deal Putin brokered to hold off the U.S. invasion a couple of years ago? How Russia has held off escalating the situation in Ukraine? If Russia were to make a move on Poland, that would justify NATO and the U.S. saying, oh, World War III is on. But apparently Paul McCleary thinks that you are also dumb, that you won't realize there isn't a good reason for Russia to do what he claims Russia is getting ready to do. Now, another piece of propaganda coming out, and it's getting a lot of play all over the corporate media, which in and of itself is reason to, you know, suspect what's going on here. And it's all variations about smugglers tried to sell nuclear material to ISIS. This is coming out of the Associated Press. And they're talking about how they caught these smugglers were going to sell enough cesium to contaminate several city blocks with a dirty bomb. And as usual, this was all set up by FBI informants. But it's getting a huge amount of press. Now, only a few weeks ago, we were seeing this claim from an authoritative source inside ISIS that ISIS was planning some kind of a nuclear attack on the West, either an outright nuclear bomb or a dirty bomb. And here we have another story trying to sell how ISIS is obtaining the nuclear materials for such an attack. Now, again, look for what should be there and isn't. What would be the consequences of a nuclear or dirty bomb going off somewhere in the United States? Obviously, the U.S. government would use such an explosion to motivate the American people into supporting more wars on ISIS, the Russians and Syrians be darned. But what does that gain ISIS? Why would they do that? ISIS is already reeling from the Russian attacks, goading the Americans right now into escalating their war makes no strategic sense whatsoever. We are hearing in all of the foreign press where ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, rebels are at this very moment begging the United States government for more weapons. And that means they're the very last people planning any kind of a nuclear attack on the United States. And before you believe this latest USDA choice bovine excrement, please remember all the other lies used to trick you into wars. There were no torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin. There was no Spanish mine that blew up the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The Lusitania was carrying weapons and was a legitimate target of war. Pearl Harbor was not a surprise. And of course, Saddam did not actually have nuclear weapons of mass destruction. So, fool me once. We're going to go to the phones here. John in Barbados, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Yeah, sitting back from all this nonsense that's going on, I'm looking at Russia, those 150,000 call-ups. I think they're just insurance policy for any retaliation through Ukraine, and I think they just sat there waiting, making sure
you could very well be correct on that. At this point, it doesn't look like they're going to be needed in Syria. Yeah.
That's one of my main points. They're not needed in Syria. But what seems to be happening in Syria, the Su-34, the cruise missiles, this device that messes with all the navigation of drones and aircraft and missiles, they're testing their new equipment in a real-world situation instead of in drills. That's what the Russians are doing, and it's being very successful.
Yes, it is. And, of course, again, any nation that has an export business in weapons will use a conflict to showcase those weapons and say, see, this is how they really work in combat. And, of course, it's a huge embarrassment to the United States because the U.S. has been selling weapons based on how they perform in tests, which usually turn out to be rigged. And right now, between the USS Donald Cook, the failure of the Predators to invade Syria undetected, the failure of the American-made F-15s flown by the Israelis to penetrate Syria undetected, the world is beginning to realize that U.S. weapons just aren't that very good. They're very expensive, but they're not very good compared to Russia.
As I say, if you look actually now, India's bought these SUs, Venezuela, several other nations that aren't exactly friendly with America.
Well, they're not friendly with America because America has not been treating them as friends. The U.S. has been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela all the way back to Hugo Chavez because Hugo was running Venezuela for the benefit of the Venezuelans, and that cannot be allowed to exist in the modern New World Order. Countries are run for the benefit of the money junkies, not the people. What's wrong with you? And so, you know, all of these countries understand the U.S. is trying to pick them off one at a time, and they're building their defenses as quickly as they can, and by buying the Russian weapons, they're getting more bang for their buck.
Well, it's looking like the policy, this Wesley Clark of 7 countries in 5 years is gone out the window, and it looks like Syria will be the final sticking point.
I would certainly hope so. I would certainly hope so. I mean, the plan that Wesley Clark leaked was supposed to be completed in 2008, and here we are coming to the end of 2015, and the U.S. has had to go back into Iraq. The U.S. is having to go back into Yemen. They're having to go back into Libya through the proxy Saudi Arabia. Yeah, the whole plan is falling apart. Unfortunately, the U.S. government is unable to say, all right, let's call it all off, and we're sorry, without the U.S. economy imploding immediately.
And it looks now a serious race between the U.S. economic collapse and World War III.
It has been for quite some time. John, I got to let you go. We got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call, and we will be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, a while back, there was a Defense Intelligence Agency report that was declassified, which basically laid out that ISIS is a creation of the United States, both directly and indirectly because of meddling in the Middle East. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda were used as tools to try and redraw the map and bring the Middle East, and especially its oil revenues, under U.S. hegemonic domination. Shackle them to the dollar. And by the way, we put a Kodak moment up at WhatReallyHappened.com. This is a photograph you will never see in the corporate media, and it shows the ISIS leader al-Baghdadi in a very friendly chit-chat with Senator John McCain. The U.S. creates the enemies and then sells you a war to save you from them. That's what's going on. And again, it's right out of 1984. The uber villain, Emmanuel Goldstein. You look at his picture, you do the 2-minute hate. And Emmanuel Goldstein was a creation of the government with which to control their people. V for Vendetta, very popular movie for very obvious reasons, and right at the very end where the High Chancellor is screaming as his advisors, we need to remind the people why they need us. They cannot survive without us. And of course, the people can survive very well without tyrannical, oppressive government. They do very well. They do much better without tyrannical, oppressive government. And that's why every tyrannical, oppressive government has to create an evil enemy that you're more afraid of than you are of the abuses of the government. It's a repeating pattern throughout history. Now, in another case of the very reckless relationship with the truth in the American corporate media, the New York Times interviewed a Russian opposition member of parliament. This is part of Putin's opposition, but described him as basically being a spokesman for the Kremlin. I mean, this guy's like Russia's equivalent of John McCain, can just spout off whatever nonsense he wants, and the New York Times is presenting it as official Russian state policy to make them look bad. The New York Times is still obfuscating the U.S. role in the bombing of that Doctors Without Borders hospital up in Afghanistan, basically acknowledging there was a U.S. strike in the region and somehow this hospital got blown up, but we're not really sure what happened. Of course we are. The people who were there on the ground know exactly what happened. Glenn Greenwald has a story out about it. The radically changing story of the U.S. airstrike on the Afghan hospital from mistake to justification. And again, when the story changes that dramatically, people just stop listening. They stop believing. Maybe that's the goal. By just changing the explanation all the time, they're hoping that we'll just throw up our hands and say, oh, who knows what the heck is going on over there. We'll go pay attention to something else here. Now, as you know, the United Nations failed in its responsibility of oversight. They backed off and they said they trust the United States to investigate how that hospital got bombed, which, by the way, is a war crime. They're refusing to investigate the initial U.S. story that there were combatants using the hospital as a launching point for attacks. And again, in the aftermath of the bombing of that hospital, plenty of dead bodies of doctors, plenty of dead bodies of nurses, plenty of dead bodies of patients, not a single dead combatant. Just was not there. Well, Doctors Without Borders is not happy with the United Nations inactions, and they're basically calling for an inquiry under the Geneva Conventions. They want to go up to The Hague and say, was this a war crime? And of course it's a war crime. You're not supposed to bomb other people's hospitals. U.S. blows up the hospital and then they pull, the Israeli tactic. Oh, they were shooting at us from there. They made us do it, mommy. Because that's what Israel said. Every time they blew up a school or a hospital in Gaza, oh, the Hamas was in there shooting at us. They cowardly are using whatever. And then Israel got caught because they put out a video claiming to show a rocket being fired from one of the schools, and it turned out the video was in a different location from 2 years ago. Remember, in the age of the Internet, the life expectancy of a government lie can be clocked with an egg timer. Got one right here. It's about worn out already. Now, up in Ukraine, Anton Gerashenko, who's an advisor to Ukrainian Interior Minister Arsen Avakov, has written on Facebook that he wants ISIS to take revenge on Russian soldiers in Syria. So it would seem that Kiev is also now a state sponsor of terror. Okay. Now, the U.S. has deployed the USS Porter into the Black Sea to maintain peace, probably because the crew of the USS Donald Cook was absolutely demoralized by their encounter with that Russian electronic warfare aircraft. Everybody's moving their resources around that area. Huge buildup of ships over there in the eastern Mediterranean. One mistake, we're going to see the biggest naval battle since the Jutland. Meanwhile, Israel has announced they have made a huge oil discovery in the Golan Heights. Enough reserves to last Israel for decades. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. There's only one small problem. The Golan Heights still technically belongs to Syria. And Israel is occupying it, but the UN has passed resolutions demanding Israel withdraw from the Golan Heights. Israel disagrees with the wording of the resolution, saying the territories are in dispute. Yes, Syria says it's on their map, but we have it from, the master of the universe that it really is supposed to belong to us along with all that oil. And yes, Israel is going to use the confusion in the north of Syria to grab the Golan and its oil resources for itself, because that's what Israel does. wait for huge moments of chaos, and then step on in and take advantage of it. Kind of like a vulture. Now, over in the West Bank, the violence continues to escalate. More and more Palestinians are being arrested, if not killed. Huge crowds of Palestinians are clashing with Israeli forces. The government of Israel is now trying to basically spin its way out of the shooting of this Palestinian teenager by saying, well, the Israeli army sharpshooter, well, he shot the wrong person. We acknowledge that. And also was really trying to shoot him in the leg, which is the humanitarian thing to do. That's the official explanation the Israeli army gave for mistakenly killing 13-year-old Abed al-Rahman Abdallah. It is a common feature of all of these governments, whether American or Israeli, or for that matter Canadian, anybody else. They won't admit wrongdoing. They won't take responsibility for the mistakes they make. It's somebody else's fault, or it's collateral damage. That's Obama's new thing for the Afghan hospital. It's not a war crime, it's just collateral damage. Well, from the people who caught the shrapnel, I think they're going to disagree. Now, here's an interesting story. This is in the Daily Mail. It turns out the U.S. Delta Force in Iraq was building improvised explosive devices for assassinations. It wasn't always the Iraqi people. Our own forces were using IEDs to assassinate people and keep it covered up. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, very early this year, Saudi Arabia's former king, Abdullah bin Abdul Aziz, passed away and was replaced by King Salman. And a lot of people were scratching their head over this because the word was that King Salman had issues of mental competency. But apparently in Saudi Arabia, as is the case in the United States of America, having a working brain is not a prerequisite for high office, and King Salman took the throne. Saudi Arabia started issuing all these statements saying, no, King Salman is fine, he doesn't have dementia, doesn't have Alzheimer's. That was then, this is now. King Salman is in the hospital for whatever it is that is inside his skull that isn't working. And we are seeing indications that Saudi Arabia may correct that earlier oversight, and there's a power grab going on as members of the royal family are jockeying. It looks like King Salman may be formally deposed if he isn't outright euthanized, and senior Saudi princes are saying, we need a regime change. This guy is not able to run a country. Like I said, that's never stopped anybody from running for office here in the United States of America. All right, we're going to go ahead and grab ourselves a phone call. Arasha in Canada, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing fine.
Excellent. I just wanted to ask you regarding the attack on the hospital in Afghanistan. It just seems highly suspect that the U.S. would attack a hospital in which Doctors Without Borders are located. And I'm sorry, I'm just getting a message. And with all the technology we have nowadays, I find it highly suspect that they would attack the location where they knew that Doctors Without Borders were in there. And my other question is that those quote unquote Taliban injured suspects that were in there, what did he do beforehand to be injured for them to be in the hospital at that same time where they were being attacked?
Well, there was a fight going on for that city, and it went back and forth a couple of times. The Taliban is trying to kick out the U.S. puppet rulers of Afghanistan, you know, growing trend across that part of the world. Now, the reason for the U.S. to target the hospital, and there is no question they knew what was there, because Doctors Without Borders had provided the GPS coordinates. So even this idea that, oh, the Afghan warlords told us to shell the building and we didn't know what it was, doesn't pass muster. The U.S. military command, knew what was exactly at those coordinates. But as for a reason for them to do it, and obviously they hoped they were going to get away with it by killing everybody in the building, Remember that every time when Israel went into Lebanon and they kept accidentally shelling the United Nations observer posts, and they kept saying it's an accident, it's an accident, it's an accident, but the goal was to get the UN to pull their observers out so that nobody was there to witness what Israel was really doing in Lebanon. I think the same thing was going on up in Afghanistan. The U.S. wants Doctors Without Borders and any other independent groups out of Afghanistan, so there are no witnesses to what the U.S. is doing, and it worked. Doctors Without Borders has now pulled all their people out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, but as far as you know, there were no UN observers in Afghanistan at that point, right?
I don't know one way or the other. I don't know one way or the other.
Okay, yeah, it'll illuminate itself in the next few weeks, I guess.
Well, I don't think we need much more illumination. Bombing a hospital, whether, especially one of our own in theory, that is a war crime, period, end of discussion.
Right.
Okay?
Yes, thank you, mate.
All right, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go. All right, let's move on to the economic news here. Things are a little bit chaotic, and yes, the stock market was up, but that doesn't really signify anything anymore. Now, we're hearing that there is a possibility of the Auto Workers Union going on strike. And apparently, they're striking against Fiat, Chrysler. They want fair contracts, pensions, and the automakers are basically saying no. So there could be a strike. At this particular time, this could be as big a blow to the American car makers as the diesel emissions scandal was to Volkswagen. And people just aren't buying cars right now. Having the workers go out on strike, well, maybe it's going to save the automakers a lot of money. They got a huge inventory of built cars waiting to sell. They could just sit back and let the union break itself with a strike. There's another way to look at the situation. Meanwhile, speaking of Volkswagen, they're taking a huge financial hit over and above the fines they're paying for cheating on the diesel emissions. Sales are dropping, and Volkswagen may be forced to pull funding away from the non-core projects. Volkswagen funds a lot of operations that are good for its public image, are not necessarily money makers, and there's even talk they may shut down the Bugatti division. Volkswagen bought Bugatti some time ago, and they may just have to shut it down, which is going to be very upsetting for Claire because her dream car is the Bugatti Veyron. She used to see it on Top Gear, and she thinks that's really, really cool. I'm more of a Range Rover person myself, but I'm driving a 2000 Honda Civic with no air conditioning. German industrial production has collapsed by 4%. That's a major, major number for a national scale figure here. Now, Ukraine's credit rating has been downgraded to restricted default, which basically makes it virtually certain Ukraine will not be able to attract any investment whatsoever. Because even in the best of times, you're not going to invest in a country where they're blowing everything up. Now, over in China, which used to be one of the biggest buyers of U.S. debt, which they were able to do with all that money they made selling manufactured goods to U.S. stores. And since American consumers can't buy that stuff anymore, China's economy is in trouble. They're dumping their U.S. treasuries. Now, what's going on here, because we're hearing all these different countries are getting out of their exposure to U.S. debt, they're dumping their treasuries, and everybody's saying, who would buy them now in this circumstance? Well, what's going on is very simple. The Federal Reserve simply invents money out of thin air, and they're buying up all those treasuries, and they will soon own, via that debt, the entire United States, all for the cost of ink and paper or the cost of worn-out keyboards. That's the scam. Now, a lot of people are very concerned about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The media is out there saying this is a good thing, it's a good thing for everybody. No, it isn't. It's pro-corporate, pro-American corporations. Obama's actually come on out and said that the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership are all about maintaining America's control over the global economy. Now, the fact that the negotiators reached an agreement on TPP doesn't mean it's happened. Every one of the 12 nations has to ratify it. And here in the United States, it's facing an uphill fight. Even Hillary Clinton has come out against it, pandering to the public opinion. Now, Congress will have 90 days to review the TPP before President Obama can sign it. And Congress has to ratify all treaties. If they don't ratify it, Obama's signature is meaningless. And more groups who are able to ferret out what's in TPP are sounding warnings. This whole trade agreement is ultra secret. You're not supposed to know what's in it. The idea is the government will sign and ratify it, and then they'll tell you what's in it. You know, every third Tuesday, somebody will come over to your house and punch you in the teeth. I'm sorry, that's the treaty obligation. And there are warnings that the Trans-Pacific Partnership and also the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership are specifically targeting the Internet to try and shut it down. There's one very bizarre clause in the TPP that has leaked out. The Trans-Pacific Partnership makes it a crime to reveal corporate wrongdoing through a computer system. In other words, anybody who runs a website who exposes corporate wrongdoing could be arrested and charged and thrown in jail. We got to take a break for news and commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Before we went to the news break, we're talking about details are starting to leak out from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I am presuming that some of the negotiators on this agreement are less than ecstatic about what it contains, and they're starting to feed bits and pieces out to their friends in either the corporate or the independent media, and some very alarming things are coming out. And to repeat what I said just before we went to the news break, there is a provision in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that makes it a crime to reveal corporate wrongdoing through a computer system. Obviously, this is an attack on whistleblowers. It's an attack on the independent media who are trying to warn the public about the dangers of GMOs or vaccines or poorly made products. This is an attack on the First Amendment right to freedom of speech, to stand up and say, hey, this product doesn't work very well. This product hurt me. This product destroyed my home and business. That's what the TPP is about. It's the rise of the corporate government on planet Earth. And corporate governments are very much like theocracies. They have no concern whatever for the civil population. Just like theocracies, everything is justified in the name of the gods. Corporatocracies justify everything in the name of increased profitability. Another provision in the Trans-Pacific Partnership requires online content providers, like YouTube and Facebook, to take down content if there's just a single complaint. All it takes is one person calling in saying, this is harming me, it's copyright violations, whatever. It has to be pulled. Could actually put some content providers out of business, using up their resources responding to all these complaints. Or the people who are trying to post messages warning about the dangers of certain products and certain chemicals, and certain drugs, having to deal with the complaint, having to constantly prove that what they are saying is true. And you know something? It doesn't even matter. It's a complaint. They don't even have to say that what you said was a lie or inaccurate. They just have to complain. It's unfair. It's anti-Semitic. Now, one other detail that has been leaked is the Trans-Pacific Partnership enforces the U.S. standard for copyrights on the rest of the 12 nations. Life of the author plus 70 years. Now, when copyright and patent first came along, it was designed to give the creator of a work or the developer of an invention a window with which to profit from their creativity and their development, but then to allow the product or the creation to enter the public domain and benefit the culture as a whole. Corporations want the protections to be permanent. So it's their property forever, and they want public domain to go away is what they want. We're seeing articles popping up all over, opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as I said in the last hour, even Hillary has come out against it. And I don't think she really cares about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She just understands a lot of voters do not want that. And she's going to try and hop on that bandwagon to distract us all from the email scandal. Not going to work, Hillary. Let's take a phone call here. Mark in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, I got two questions for you.
Sure.
One is, I just walked in and I turned you on, and I heard, did you just say that McCain, one of those people he met with was actually Baghdadi?
Yes, there's a photo of them.
Wow. And this hasn't been coming out, this isn't a scandal?
It's been all over the independent media, and it's a scandal. And by the way, it's not just the one picture. There are multiple pictures of John McCain hobnobbing with the ISIS leadership. Just like, remember that photo of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein when the U.S. was giving him the chemical and biological weapons they later turned around and bombed him for having?
Well, it's just that they've been saying, though, that McCain really met with the Free Syrian Army. Like I said, I don't think the Free Syrian Army is what I think it's really another word for Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra.
They're just throwing the labels around to keep things obfuscated. There's the hired mercenaries working for the U.S. to overthrow Assad, and then there's Assad, and that's it. And it doesn't matter what labels are out there, because it's all made up to try and scare you into going along with the U.S. agenda.
Unbelievable. But anyway, the other thing I want to ask you about is with TPP, if this thing was passed, and let's say we elected Donald Trump as president, would Trump be able to just break it and say, this is unconstitutional, I'm not going to honor it, period. This is, the Constitution there's nothing in the Constitution that lets a foreign nation, a foreign body dominate the United States, period, and just ignore it? Can he do that?
Well, I mean, he could cite all the precedent for the U.S. breaking treaties left and right. I mean, we violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with regards to Iran. We violated the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. Violated the Anti-Ballistic Missile, the ABM Treaty, with the development of our new weapon system. So Trump has plenty of precedent. Now, everybody who's out there championing the Trans-Pacific Partnership is out there reminding everybody that under the Constitution, treaties become the supreme law of the land. Okay? What they fail to do is to read the next part down in the Constitution saying, as long as those treaties do not violate the Constitution itself. So there's a little safety valve in there. So anything that's in the TPP that violates our Constitution is automatically null and void underneath the Supreme Court decision Marbury versus Madison.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, too, is you see what they're starting to bring these so-called refugees into Arizona now. Do you think the governor could, and why don't they, the governor and maybe the elected sheriffs, just say you're not coming in, period, go to the airports, use armed force and say you're not coming in, and that means federal agents would be arrested by trying to enforce it. Just like if the federal agents tried to enforce, let's say, gun confiscation, if Obama
Yeah, they are risking an armed confrontation, and not just here in the United States of America. All of Europe is very angry about this. Now, remember that story we reported yesterday where one of these No Borders activists was raped by Sudanese refugees and was told by her fellow activists, don't report it. You'll harm the No Borders cause. So that basically, for me, confirms that all of this flooding of Mexicans and Central Americans and Syrians and Yemenites and Libyans and everything into the U.S. and Europe is all about destroying our sense of a national cultural identity as a stepping stone to simply saying the borders don't matter anymore. Everybody is everybody. We don't need the borders anymore. Hail the New World Order, and, here's your global currency loaned at interest.
Well, thank God the United States has a Second Amendment, but the problem in Europe is they don't have any such thing, and they're almost completely disarmed. So
well, it varies from country to country, and I don't think the EU has stepped into that just yet. I mean, remember, Switzerland, gun ownership is mandatory. Everybody's got guns.
One of the countries being overrun. Look at Germany. As far as I know, the Germans are, the Germans, it looks to me like the Stasi has just delayed effect and taken over the East German government. I mean, I think Merkel was a communist before when she was under East Germany, and she's appointing Stasi members to enforce certain, anti-free speech laws.
Well, there's a petition drive and protests in Germany. They want Merkel out, and this whole thing could easily blow up in the globalist space because it's just making everybody angry. I'm sorry, got to let you go. Got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and we're going to go ahead and take a phone call here. Chuck in Minnesota. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi. I was pulling into a grocery store that you can only get into half of it because they're fixing the road, and there's a guy controlling the gate so the trucks can come in and out, and he's checking his device with a safety harness on. So I jotted down your website and a couple other ones, and I went over and talked to him for a minute. And he asked me, about what your site is, and I told him and stuff, and he started singing verses of Country Joe and the Fish song. It goes as follows, come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Why, man, this war's a go-go. There's plenty of good money to be made supplying the Army with the tools of the trade.
That sounds like a good song here. I'm going to have to hunt that down and get permission to use it as a bump segment.
Yeah, I think it would be great. And about everybody I pass out this, these sites, they thank me and say they're going to check it out when they get home.
Well, our numbers are trending up on the server, so I think, all of you who are out there sharing the website and the radio show, you're having an effect because our numbers are going up even as the corporate media numbers continue to go down.
Okay, well, keep up the good work. Yeah.
Long as I can. Thank you very much for the kind words, and we're going to let you go. Now, back to the economy. Story coming out of Investment Watch blog, the Fed blew it. More QE on the horizon. And basically, in a nutshell, we've reached the point where the only thing the Federal Reserve can do is run that printing press or type lots of zeros into those computers to keep the system propped up. The economy is broken. Huge wealth inequality issue. Not enough currency floating in circulation in the entire nation to power commerce. It's all concentrated at the top. Now, Jim Willey is out there saying the Federal Reserve is already engaging in $1 trillion of quantitative easing per month to prop up the stock market. That is not being officially acknowledged. And all of this QE, which is another word for hyperinflation, of course, is encouraging other countries to drop the U.S. dollar and go with more solid, reliable currencies like the renminbi, the yuan, and the ruble, which, of course, inevitably triggers U.S. threats of invasion and conquest, unless you, by golly, stay with the dollar. And that's also a big part of what is inside the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is shackling all the countries to the U.S. dollar no matter how bad the U.S. dollar gets. It's trying to basically revive Bretton Woods all over again. And the U.S. is luring these other countries to sign the treaty by saying that if you will sign this treaty that you're going to go on using the U.S. dollar, we'll cancel all the tariffs for your imported goods. What's that going to do? Destroy more American businesses who cannot compete with the imported goods. That's what it's going to do. Now, the International Monetary Fund has cut their global growth forecast for the fourth time in the last year, and yet somehow the stock market is at record highs again. So even the corporate media is starting to scratch their heads that the soaring Dow doesn't make any sense. It's totally disconnected from the economic reality in this country. And yet, Washington, D.C. and the corporate media continue to use it as a banner about the economy's in recovery. Look at those stock market numbers. They're really up there. Everything is wonderful on Wall Street. And if you're going hungry and you've lost your business and your home and your job, it has to be your fault. It's something you're doing wrong. We're not to blame. And yes, they are. Meanwhile, over in Brussels, the anti-austerity protests have reached such a fever pitch, the police are having to use water cannons against their own people to push them back. Now remember, if you, of your own free will, choose a simpler, less costly lifestyle, that is austerity. When the government comes in and forces you to live a simpler, less costly lifestyle so that the surplus cash can be given to the bankers, that is dictatorship. Now then, on to Hillary Clinton and her email server woes. It's getting worse. Hillary's trying to find some way to distract everybody away from it. They're trying to pretend it's old news. Pay no attention to that email server locked in the closet. And apparently, employees at the company that was doing the backup services for Hillary's private email server. It started out in her house, and then it was moved to a data center in New Jersey in 2013. Now, the data center, like data centers everywhere, has backup service. And the company who was doing the backup services, okay, wrote emails expressing their concern that they were being told by the Clintons to start getting rid of any backups older than 30 days, which is not their normal policy. And they actually wrote letters, memos, to preserve the train of concern, saying that they wanted it in writing from the Clintons, that they wanted this change in the duration that backups were to be kept. And basically expressed the opinion that they were involved in some serious blank, some shady blank. They are very worried that they were in the middle of something that really was not on the up and up. So, now Hillary's emails were backed up, and the Benghazi Committee is getting them. Department of Justice is going through their computers. Apparently 4 of the Department of Justice servers are now in the hands of the FBI. And it sounds really intense, but I have to tell you, it almost feels like a theater piece. Everybody's scrambling around, finding extra servers and all the rest of this stuff. Doesn't the National Security Agency already have this? Hillary's server was outside the government. Would have been wide open to NSA. Now, NSA built all these costly data centers all over the world to copy and store all Americans' emails. So there's only one of 2 possible outcomes that we're looking at. The FBI and the Department of Justice are putting on this big dog and pony show of being thorough in investigating Hillary's email, at the end of which they'll say, well, we actually didn't find anything. Sort of a repeat of what they did during the investigation into murdered White House Deputy Counsel Vince Foster. Or, second theory, the NSA claim that they're spying on all Americans and saving our phone calls and reading all of our emails is a gigantic bluff to scare us into silence. And still, nobody in the government or the corporate media will ask if Hillary's combination of a weak email server holding many of the nation's secret and a charitable foundation legally allowed to accept foreign donations meant a repeat of the Chinagate scandal, Secrets for Cash. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Now, this is an important question. And it is very obvious at this point, nobody wants to touch it, either in the government or the corporate media. Back in 1996, there was a scandal called Chinagate, where President Bill Clinton authorized the sale of highly sensitive technology to China, technology with military application that allowed them to improve their ICBMs, which are kind of pointed our way. And at the same time, huge donations, first of all from the companies that were making money selling the technology to China, and then from American citizens of Chinese origin, started pouring into Bill Clinton's re-election campaign. And it eventually came out that these American citizens were getting the money they were donating to Clinton from Asian sources, including Chinese intelligence. It was called Chinagate. So, we know the Clintons don't have a problem treating U.S. secrets as their own personal property and trading them for campaign donations. So now we have today Hillary's email server with weaker security than Ashley Madison, one completely open subdomain on which were parked many of the nation's secrets. We know it's been hacked. That's been established. And we have the Clinton Foundation, which is legally allowed to accept foreign donations, and 40% of the donations come from foreign sources. Some of them, we don't know where they came from, because the Clintons set up a little subsidiary over in Sweden where foreign entities donated to that, and the money was transferred in a lump and identified as coming from the subsidiary with no other identification attached to it. Now, Larry Klayman, formerly of Judicial Watch, found enough information to basically show Hillary was granting high-level access in exchange for heavy donations to the Clinton Foundation, and filed a RICO lawsuit against the Clintons. And he had a case, but the case was thrown out of court by the judge who was appointed by Bill Clinton and refused to recuse himself despite a very obvious conflict of interest. This is a question that must be asked. And by the way, I go out on the corporate media comment sections on all the articles about the email scandal, and I post that question. And Hillary's minions are now following me all over the net saying, oh, do you know they got a sale on tinfoil down at the hardware store? And calling my mother bad names. And they don't have anything else. They can't actually say this is, you know, absolutely beyond the possibility of being done because of what happened back in 1996. So, this is a call to Rivero's Rangers. I need you to copy off the comments that I've made about Hillary Clinton's email server and Chinagate. And everywhere you go, any corporate media website that is allowing comments on the email server scandal, you post that question. And we're going to force it. We're going to force them to confront that question. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a phone call here. Thomas in North Carolina. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, well, I actually kind of remember that because it wasn't the Lewinsky scandal like a big cover-up in the media to prevent the general public from realizing that he was under impeachment for Chinagate?
Well, he was technically impeached for lying to Congress about the Monica Lewinsky affair, but they were using Monica Lewinsky and Hummers in the Oval Office to draw our attention away from all of the scandals that were going on. The Clintons' links to the Iran-Contra gun and drug running out of Arkansas down to Nicaragua, the use of Whitewater, Castle Grande, and Flowerwood as money laundering for this cocaine smuggling that was going on by the CIA, the manufacture of the illegal guns. I mean, all of that. And Kenneth Starr, who took over the investigation, basically put the focus on the stained blue dress and got everybody distracted with this tawdry sex scandal, because you need to remember that Kenneth Starr, when he was younger, was the assistant to Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, William French Smith, who changed the rules allowing the CIA to hang out with drug smugglers and not have to report it to the Drug Enforcement Agency. And a lot of people have called that the CIA's license to smuggle, and there's nothing new there. The CIA was running heroin out of Vietnam when we were stuck in the Vietnam War. The CIA took it over from French intelligence, which had been running heroin into Europe. Remember the movie The French Connection? Okay, it was based on a true story. That was the French Connection, French intelligence, bringing heroin from Vietnam back to Europe and also across the Atlantic to New York. Okay?
Sir. Yes, that's certainly interesting. I wasn't aware of all of that, and it certainly enlightens me. Is there much connection that you're aware of that the Afghan heroin trade was dominated by the Soviets and they were selling in the U.S., and then so the U.S. decided to go in, take over Afghanistan, and start selling heroin in
No,
Russia.
what happened is when the Taliban took over Afghanistan after the Soviet Union pulled out, they shut down all the opium production. And that meant nobody who was running opium, including the CIA, could get any from Afghanistan. And that, along with the pipeline right of way, was the reason the U.S. went into Afghanistan right after 9/11, even though Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11, basically took the place over. They installed Hamid Karzai, who'd been a consultant for Unocal, one of the oil companies that went to Congress and said, we need a regime change there so we can get our pipeline, and they made him the new U.S. puppet president of Afghanistan, and the poppies started blooming. And we have photos of American forces guarding and protecting the opium poppies and shipping the raw opium.
Oh, yes, I'm a bit aware of that. It was just my understanding that the Soviets had, when they left, that their agents remained in Afghanistan and controlled the trade. That was just what I was hearing, and I just wanted to...
Well, I mean, you know, if any Soviet agents who remained in Afghanistan after the Soviet pullout, they didn't have anything to do because the Taliban shut it all down. If you were caught with an opium poppy, they'd take your hand right off. A little brutal, but it was effective. Opium out of Afghanistan simply vanished until the U.S. invasion.
Yeah, and you also brought up the carpetbaggers hoax, in which that they used that event in order to sell war to the general public, even though... And this is partially why I was calling, because Ryan Dawson actually challenged someone to have a Skype call over no planes. And a lot of times companies like, or news agencies like INFOWARS, Alex Jones wants to say that planes still hid, as well as the official conspiracy theorist Jesse Ventura. You know, they're saying the same narrative. And having an engineering background myself, I comprehend what the difference is in metal strength and physics of velocity, and I can pretty much assure you that no aluminum projectiles can physically penetrate a structural steel.
Well, we're going to have to disagree. We're going to have to disagree on that one, and thank you very much for the phone call. All right, now then, getting on back to Hillary Clinton and her email server. It is getting very intense. Rudolph Giuliani has gone public, listing out all of the federal crimes Hillary should be investigated for, could be prosecuted for. Got a list of 15. Hillary's own associates are telling her it's time for her to get a good criminal defense lawyer, because we're still slightly more than a year away from the election. She's not going to be able to hold this off for an entire year. This is going to keep coming back to haunt her until she's either in jail or quits politics. We'll be back after these commercials. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking about Hillary's server. And yesterday, of course, the Department of Justice put out a call to Hillary through her lawyer saying, you better start getting all of the emails, because they're now aware that Hillary Clinton lied when she said she turned over all work-related emails, because there's evidence that she didn't. Now, remember, when this whole issue of the private server came up, nobody knew there was a private email server until the Benghazi committee were getting copies of emails from the State Department and noticed Hillary Clinton's official State Department email address wasn't being used. That's when they found out about the private server. It's sort of like Richard Nixon's tape system at the White House. Nobody was supposed to know about that. So when the Benghazi committee started asking Clinton about the server, she told them there was only one email address she used for both personal and State Department emails on her server, hdr22@clintonemail.com. Then it turned out, the New York Times found out she'd had a second secret email address, HROD17@clintonemail.com, which means Hillary Clinton lied to the Benghazi committee. that she only had one email address she was using. And now we're getting indications there may have even been additional private email accounts on her server. When you've got your own server, you can have all the email accounts you want, which also undermines her original explanation that she had her own server to keep her life simple. And again, call to Rivero's Rangers. Everywhere you see this story about the emails or the servers being reported, get into the comments section and ask the question. Knowing that the Clintons had the 1996 Chinagate scandal, it is valid to ask if Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server with weak security holding U.S. secrets, coupled with her charitable foundation, was actually a repeat of Chinagate. She was selling U.S. secrets for donations. We got to force that question out there. Meanwhile, earlier, there was a Democratic representative tried to introduce an amendment to a bill to dismantle the Benghazi Committee. Just shut it all down. It's just a witch hunt. It's the best right-wing conspiracy. And basically was trying to put this amendment into the spending bill that they wanted to take out the language abolishing Planned Parenthood funding and instead put in the language saying we're going to shut down the Benghazi Committee. Now, when you actually try and shut down the investigating committee, I mean, that's like a flashing neon sign. Guilty, guilty, guilty. G-U-I-L-T-Y, guilty, 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 with an arrow pointing at Hillary. Now, the good news is the House voted that down. Representative Louise Slaughter, who was the ranking member of the House Rules Committee, was trying to get that in there to derail the Benghazi Committee, to protect Hillary Clinton on the email scandal and leave totally unanswered what happened to those 4 people who were killed in the consulate. They don't matter. They're already dead. Who cares anyway? What difference does it make anyway? Well, the difference it makes is setting the possibility that Hillary was selling U.S. secrets in exchange for donations to her foundation. There's the question of the fact, we now know for a fact the U.S. government was running guns to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria through that consulate in Benghazi, which is kind of a weird thing for a president to do who's out there screaming about gun control. Kind of a little disparity there. And if Hillary did that on her own, it's an act of treason, giving aid and comfort to enemy in time of war. If Barack Obama ordered Hillary to do this, it basically reveals the entire war on terror as a complete fraud and a hoax and a lie. And that's why the Benghazi Committee's work is so important, to find out what was really going on. These are big secrets. Remember what I said before? There's 2 kinds of secrets in Washington, D.C. There's the little secrets that you can use as fodder during the campaign. This candidate was busted for gay sex, or that candidate was arrested for marijuana. Then there are the great secrets, the ones that, if revealed, could bring down the entire government. The truth behind the Kennedy assassination, the truth behind the Federal Reserve, the truth behind 9/11. A serving Secretary of State spying and betraying her country. The U.S. government arming these terrorist groups we're all being told to be afraid of to justify wars of conquest. Those are great secrets. They don't want them to come out. We have to force the issue. Anyway, so in any event, the House voted it down. The Benghazi Committee is still moving forward. And we're going to go ahead, well, we don't know who that is on the line yet. There is a story that El Chapo, the recently miraculously escaped Mexican drug lord, has put a $100 million bounty on Donald Trump, dead or alive, which makes a convenient cover story if they're going to give him the Robert Kennedy treatment to get him out of the campaign. Because the Ron Paul treatment isn't working, is it? So Donald Trump gets shot. Oh, it was El Chapo. It was all the fault of the Mexican drug lord. Really, you don't need to look any further than that. This stinks to high heaven. All righty, we're going to grab ourselves a phone call. DJ in Florida, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, it's, DJ from, Atlanta.
From Atlanta, okay.
Yeah, am I good to go?
Yeah, you're good to go, but we only have a couple of minutes.
Okay, yeah. So, the comment I want to make is, media keeps saying that, Russia was, trying to invade, Ukraine and now that I think the propaganda is starting to fail, on that front when people realize how Putin and Russia are handling Syria, that they were invited in and they're actually going after targets and supporting the governments of those countries and not actively invading and taking the offensive approach. And a lot of people who didn't know what was going on with Russia or believed the Ukraine propaganda are now seeing the truth of the matter, and they're like backtracking all these stories and realizing, oh, wait a minute, Russia wasn't invading Syria, and the U.S. keeps saying that they are. Maybe they're not invading Ukraine either. Maybe they were taking a defensive approach, and they were actually
there's something that the Russian Foreign Ministry pointed out that we all need to keep in mind. The U.S. was putting out all these supposed satellite photos of Russian hardware on the ground in Ukraine, and they were black and white and blurry, and you really couldn't see much of anything. It was just kind of white blobs over gray blobs, and take our word for it, they're Russian tanks. And yet, when the U.S. released satellite photos of the Russian aircraft on those runways in Syria, they were crystal clear and sharp as tacks. And that disparity, you tell you, anytime you see a photo of something that's been blurred, they're hiding the fact that it's a fake or it's not what you're being told it is. And I remember when they were selling this whole weapons of mass destruction in Iraq story, and they had these blurry photos with white blobs say, these are biological weapons, mobile laboratories, and decontamination vehicles. And then following the invasion, somebody went to check, and they found out they were just everyday, ordinary fire trucks. And that's how the U.S. does it. But at this point, the U.S. propaganda facade is crumbling very rapidly, and each new exposed lie only encourages more and more Americans to go back and re-examine everything we've been told throughout our entire lives, looking for falsehoods. And once you start looking for them, you are going to find them. Anyway, DJ, I need to let you go here. We're at the top of the hour, and that means it's time for our news break and our commercials, and we'll be back with hour number 3 after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, third hour. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645. Tom is still ready to answer the phone call. We're going to go ahead and take a call from Nathan in California. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Oh, hi, Michael. High school class of 69 checking in. We were a rowdy bunch, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I'm glad I didn't go to Vietnam. Thank you. Anyway, I was looking around YouTube last night for some videos on the Russian presence in Syria, and I went to Alex Jones, and I noticed that he had Matt Drudge, on an interview or something. And Matt Drudge, at about the half-hour mark, he mentions that Limbaugh, Savage, Hannity, and Levin are people that he considered to be brave against the grain people. And he doesn't mention anybody in the independent media like yourself or many others that are really brave against the grain kind of people. And, what is wrong with this guy to make a statement like that? That's totally irresponsible, in my opinion.
Well, that basically tells you who his allegiances really are with. And Matt Drudge and I, came to a parting of the ways way, way, way back. Because when he first started Drudge Report, and I was just starting what would become WhatReallyHappened.com, this was back in 1997, and I'd been doing what I was doing for 3 years, and Drudge was just starting out there. And I tried to bring to Matt Drudge's attention the official FBI documents that proved the FBI was fraudulently manufacturing the testimony of Lisa Foster, regarding the gun found with her husband's body. It's in the FBI's own documentation. And Drudge refused to touch it. Instead, he went with this bogus allegation against Clinton associate Sidney Blumenthal, who was now popping up again in relation to the email scandal, that was totally without any foundation, some kind of a domestic abuse issue. Blumenthal sued Drudge for $30 million libel, made Drudge a household name and an internet sensation. Drudge even got a brief show of his own on Fox News, and then the lawsuit just magically went away. And it seems like in hindsight, the lawsuit's only purpose was to promote Matt Drudge as the go-to place for independent media of the time. And since then, it's been very obvious to me that Matt Drudge will not cross certain lines. But you're absolutely right. In this interview that he did, the fact that he's admiring these icons of the corporate media tells you that he sees himself as corporate media as well.
Well, thank you very much for straightening me out, because I was pretty shocked to hear that. And
I wasn't. I expected it. You know.
Well, there's some areas where I'm just a real dummy, and I'll let you go, Michael. But one last thing: the Pentagon is in a pretty precarious situation with the Russians in Syria. And the only thing I know that they might be able to do to mess up the Russians, they're bringing emperor penguins from Antarctica, and they're going to put the penguins, if they can sneak them into Syria, and try to fool the Russians into believing that they're, you know, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of this stuff. But they're really worried about the animal rights activists, you know, coming in and messing things up. And on that note, you know, there's your little secret bit of information, and I wish you a good show.
All right, well, thank you very much for that chilling piece of news. We'll let you go right there. All right, getting on back to the candidates who are still jockeying for attention and poll numbers. Marco Rubio is out there saying that he thinks it's worth the risk of war with Russia to press the U.S. interests in Syria. This is coming from Marco Rubio. And apparently to Marco Rubio, it is of no concern that Syria's government asked Russia for their help against the terrorist threat. It's of no concern to Marco Rubio that the United States does not actually have a legal foundation for intervening in Syria or any of these other countries. The entire rationale is American exceptionalism. We're exceptional, so we're allowed to go into other people's countries and tell them what to do. And we've heard this song and dance before. You know, American exceptionalism, God's chosen people, the master race. We've heard it before. Convincing a people that they're somehow automatically superior and therefore should be allowed to go tell the rest of the world what they want to do. And Marco Rubio has signed on to this. And Marco, if you really think war with Russia is worth it, here's your rifle, here's your parachute, watch your head climbing into that transport plane, and we'll call Putin and tell him you are on your way there to wish him a happy birthday. So, anyway, over at one of the events for Bernie Sanders, there's been a bit of a stink where some of the people at the event wanted to ask questions about what's going on with Israel and Palestine, and to criticize Israel on some of their recent actions, and apparently that was absolutely verboten. There will be no dissent on Israel at a Bernie Sanders event. So we know who's pulling Bernie Sanders' puppet strings. Now then, little comment on Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham is out there demanding federal aid for flood relief in South Carolina, which is okay. Don't have a problem with that. The problem I have with it is Lindsey Graham voted against relief for the victims of Hurricane Sandy. So it's a little double standard, a little hypocrisy. Bad when it happens to be, not all that big a deal if it happens to some other state here. By the way, speaking of the flooding, everybody is hopping on saying, well, what was the reason for the flooding? Oh, it's global warming, global cooling. It's the collapse of the flood control infrastructure. But Pat Robertson says he's got the answer. The floods have hit South Carolina because we're letting gays get married, and if we don't stop that, God will flood all 50 of the states. Which just has me a little bit worried because my neighbor is out there building this really big wooden boat, and the animals keep getting into my azaleas. I look at Pat Robertson on the corporate media with this nonsense, and I'm wondering, why does anyone still pay attention to this guy? And by the way, have you noticed how the corporate media still has this love affair with all of these aged fossils who were behind this claim that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons? And like Brian Williams, they keep bringing them back to lie again. It's amazing here. Now, apparently over in Great Britain, Jeremy Corbyn is out there campaigning, and the establishment is just as terrified of him as they are of Trump here in the United States. And apparently Corbyn is under attack because he gave an address recently, and he's being criticized for failing to mention Israel even once. How dare you give a speech without talking about Israel in Great Britain? There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And it's not just Corbyn. Apparently, Bethany Mandel over in the Realist Report, or as reported in the Realist Report, is attacking Trump for not denouncing anti-Semitism. And you know, this is actually a good thing, because between all of this obvious attacks on candidates for not serving Israel and the recent debacle with AIPAC and Netanyahu over the Iran nuclear deal, the American people are finally being forced to confront Washington, D.C. is a puppet regime, a Vichy government serving Tel Aviv, which means they are not serving the American people or the American nation. And we're going to remember that a year from now at election time. We'll be right back. Oh, hi, America. Welcome back to our show. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the program, up in Germany, there are major protests against Angela Merkel. There is a petition drive underway calling for her resignation and immediate re-election of the German government. And a major issue for them is the unbridled immigration coming into Germany. All of these refugees that are coming on in. And again, it looks like what's going on in Europe, in the United States, is an effort to blur our sense of a national, regional, or cultural identity so they can drop the borders. Remember that activist who got raped by the Sudanese refugees was told, don't report it, you'll harm the no borders cause. There's even an article over here from Lively. Game over Europe, a color revolution is coming. We're going to flood you with people from all over the world, so there won't be a reason for borders. And they're pushing for the one world government. And I'm very much opposed to that. If there's a single global government, and that government falls into the hands, as it inevitably will, a Pol Pot, a Stalin, a Hitler, or George W. Bush, there's nobody to stand up in opposition. That's dangerous. Another reason I'm opposed to a global government is a single global government will end the evolution of human civilization. We have seen it time and time again. All governments, they paralyze themselves. They preserve the status quo. They don't want anything to change. There was a story we ran at WhatReallyHappened.com about an activist for alternative therapies for cancer, talking about some progress that's being made in that area, and he ran into a brick wall, and he finally realized the government doesn't want any new cures for cancer because they're all making too much money off the treatments, and they don't want to disturb that. Governments do not think about the future. They like everything just the way it is now. And if there's a single global government, there's no place on earth where you can experiment with a new, potentially better system of government. All governments are oligarchies, and a global government will be the biggest oligarchy of all. I think humanity is best served by a planet with 1,000 little tiny nations, each taking care of their own needs and their own people, trading across the borders, tourism, peace through commerce. Because inevitably, the rise of any great empire brings with it great suffering. Now, there's an article over in Breitbart that apparently the influx of immigrants has brought with it a major rape crisis. And it's not being reported. Even though the feminists in the U.S. are screaming campus rape as part of their campaign, they don't want to talk about the epidemic of rape taking place in all these areas where the immigrants are coming in. It harms the cause of no borders. And Europe is dealing with the same filtering mechanism the United States is. The people most likely to come across the border are people who couldn't make it in their home countries, people who behaved badly in their home country. They're fleeing prosecution. We're not getting the best of the best. I mean, Central American governments in Mexico are laughing at the United States open border policy. They're saying, great, we're going to get rid of all of our losers. Let the Norteamericanos take care of them. Finland has gone public saying that this idea that these are refugees is nonsense. They're mostly male. They're not from Syria. And by the way, all these refugees are flooding into the countries with the best welfare benefits. All right, we're going to grab ourselves a phone call. Roseanne from North Carolina, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Michael, hi. First of all, I just stumbled onto your website a couple days ago, and I've been in heaven ever since.
Oh, well, thank you.
Everything, I watched your show last night, and I agreed with everything you were saying. To me, I'm in heaven. Okay. But anyway, stop waving. So anyway, my question is, do you feel our elections are fake? Because I kind of do. And if so, for how long? And my second question was, I just barely caught the tail end of you talking about Matt Drudge. And I read Breitbart every day, and then if I have time, I'll do Drudge. Where does Breitbart fit on your scale of believability or, credibility, whatever you want to call it?
I have much more regard and respect for Breitbart than I do for Drudge. Drudge is kind of low down on the totem pole for me. As far as the election fraud issue, there's always been a degree of election fraud, and it has to do with how many safeguards are put in place to guard against it. And hand-counted ballots and full reporting of tallies all the way from the individual precinct stations up to the grand totals is a perfect way to do that. But with the advent of these electronic machines, we can't follow the votes. And it's rather amazing that a lot of these electronic voting machines are made by the same companies that make the automated teller machines at the bank. And the teller machines have got paper tracking, paper records, full audit capability. The voting machines do not. And the other major problem with our national elections, and a lot of people don't know this, the final totals for the national elections are announced not by a government agency, not by a citizens vote counting group, but by a private company called Voters News Service. They change their name every once in a while, but it's the same group. And Voters News Service is owned by the big TV networks and a couple of major newspapers. And everybody who's running elections will send in their totals to Voters News Service, and Voters News Service will simply announce who our new leaders are, and there's zero accountability and zero tracking. And my position...
So they could say anything.
They have been caught. Shaving off percentages in the Iowa caucuses. They have been caught in misstatements. And,
yeah, because Rich Santorum won it back in 2012, and then they announced it 2 weeks later, and they're like, oh, my bad, Rick won.
Well, here's the situation. In any other country, when the official results don't match the exit polls, the first thing they scream is voter fraud, election fraud. Here in the United States, when the official results don't match the exit polls, they come up with lame excuses like, oh, well, the voters were lying to the exit pollers. That's the only possible explanation.
Right.
When Hillary had her come-from-behind victory in the New Hampshire primary against Obama, that was the excuse, that the voters were lying to the exit pollers. Those voters don't know the exit pollers. They don't care enough to lie to them. It's massive election fraud. And if you've never been there, you need to visit a website called blackboxvoting.org. It's run by a wonderful lady named Bev Harris. There was even an HBO documentary called Hacking Democracy about Bev Harris and all the massive election fraud we're seeing in this country. And frankly, if the government cannot prove the honesty and accuracy of the elections by which they claim authority, then we're not obligated to obey them, pay their bills, and certainly not to sacrifice the lives of our children in their wars. Got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the phone call, Roseanne. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And apparently this is breaking on Twitter right now. As I mentioned earlier in the program, the New York Times is trying to put the best possible face on the U.S. bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And the New York Times is saying, yes, there was a U.S. airstrike. We're not sure how the hospital got hit. They may have been aiming at a nearby target. There may have been people shooting from adjacent buildings. Well, somebody actually went out on Google Earth and took a look at this Doctors Without Borders hospital. It is sitting all by itself in this huge open space of gardens and fields. And Doctors Without Borders had provided the GPS coordinates to NATO and the U.S. government. There is no way the U.S. did not know it was a hospital. And there are no nearby buildings that could be concealing the evil Taliban or be confused for the hospital. They lied, they lied, they lied, they lied. That's the motto of the U.S. government. If at first you don't succeed, lie, lie again. And anybody who refuses to believe the lie, you denounce them for their lack of patriotism. Patriots will believe the bovine excrement. Loyal Americans believe the lies. Only those extremists want the truth and the Bill of Rights. All right, so let's talk about what's going up on Oregon. As you know, Barack Obama is getting ready to go up to Oregon so he can wave the bloody shirt and stand on the dead bodies and push his gun-grabbing agenda. The net effect of that already is that gun and ammo sales have gone through the roof again. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. And apparently the residents of Roseburg are organizing a massive demonstration to basically let Barack Obama know he and his gun-grabbing agenda are not welcome in their town. It's going to be rather interesting to see if there's a confrontation. More and more information is coming out about Chris Mercer. He was apparently on 5 types of medication, prescription psychiatric medication, which in his own online writings, he wasn't being very careful what he was taking when. He just grabbed 4 pills out of the bottle and take them. Had them all in one bottle, just shake them up. It's also come out that he was suffering from Asperger's syndrome. Now, Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum disorder and is thought to be caused by vaccine damage. We're literally wrecking the brains of people, and then when they flip out and do something bizarre, oh, we'll just blame the guns. We can't challenge the prescription medication industry. They're making too much money and paying too much taxes. We'll just blame the guns here. And nobody's buying it. Nobody's buying it. Article from Health and Money News. Guns do not kill people. Doctors and drug companies do. And this particular article is talking about the mass shootings and the suicide epidemics and the explosion of domestic violence since these prescription antidepressants flooded into the market. And they're talking about the fact that the pharmaceutical industry has been forced to put a little warning on their products saying, yeah, this stuff may make you kill somebody else or yourself. But it's in little tiny letters down at the bottom. And it's certainly not mentioned on the commercials. Actually, that's not true. I have actually seen some of these big pharmaceutical commercials for these mind-altering drugs, and that real fast voice at the end says, yeah, you may get some suicidal thoughts. It's no big deal. Just talk to your doctor if you're still alive in the morning. Everybody understands what's going on, but we can't challenge the money. Money rules all decisions in government here in the United States of America. It overrides safety concerns, health concerns. Remember what I said before. The health industry does not want you to be healthy. They can't make money off of you if you're healthy. They need you to be chronically, constantly ill so they can sell you treatments for your symptoms. But don't hold your breath waiting for a cure. Nobody wants a cure. A cure is bad business. A cure is a one-time sale and then you're gone. Treatments keep you coming back month after month, year after year. Now, over in Nevada, Assemblywoman Michelle Fiore is saying it is time for a study of what medications these mass shooters were on. Now, it used to be possible to get that, but starting with Sandy Hook, they stopped releasing the medical history of the shooters under the claim that it violated their right to privacy. Mind you, we're talking about people who are dead. Yes, they're dead, but they have a right to be private about what mental medications they were on before. It was absurd. Now, there was this bizarre video that came out of Connecticut following the Sandy Hook shooting where citizens groups were trying to use Connecticut's equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act to find out what psychiatric medication the Sandy Hook shooter, Adam Lanza, was on. And in this video, there was a lawyer there from the state medical examiner's office, Patrick Quanachet, who argued that even if the prescription psychiatric medication caused Adam Lanza to do what he did, supposedly, that wasn't important for the general public to know. In fact, it could be harmful because they might stop taking their prescribed medications. And then if you look at how much prescription pharmaceuticals contribute to Connecticut's economy, you understand what the real agenda is. We don't care if you're shooting each other on these medications. We just want to keep selling the medications. Now, Congress actually held hearings looking at the link between SSRIs and acts of extreme, bizarre violence, but because they're all getting campaign checks from big pharmaceutical corporations, they didn't do anything. Yes, there seems to be a problem, but we're not going to deal with it now. Getting on back to Oregon, the residents of Roseburg are saying it's time to stop mentioning this guy's name, because from his writings, he apparently thought this horrible crime was going to make his name famous. And the best way to deal with that is don't mention his name. Let him descend into anonymity. Don't remember who he was. Now then. And to tell you how everybody is leaping onto this for their own political agenda, very bizarre story where apparently this shooter's mother was reading Donald Trump's book while she was pregnant. The idea being that the fetus was listening to the book and therefore was going to be a Trump supporter. Now, that's a real trick when you have Planned Parenthood saying it's just a blob of protoplasm, it doesn't know anything, and it doesn't feel any pain or think, and now they're turning around and saying, oh, yes, he was raised to be a Trump supporter. So they're trying to use the shooting to tarnish Donald Trump. That is really desperation on the cusp of madness. Meanwhile, Obama is out there pounding his gun grabber agenda, and there's some very alarming tendencies in his speech, where he's out there talking about, the politics have to change, meaning they want to get rid of the Second Amendment. And he's talking about how, people who think the government gun grab is all about consolidating government power, they're just wacko conspiracy theories. You shouldn't be thinking about them. And then he talks about gun rights activists as the enemy and absolutists. And remember, both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security say that if you are a supporter of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you are a potential terrorist. You are a suspect if you support the founding principles of this nation. That's how far through the looking glass we have gone. So, anyway, we're going to take a commercial break, back with the last segment of our program after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of our program today. And before we get on back to the gun grabber nonsense, we're getting breaking news. Apparently, Deutsche Bank has pre-announced a massive loss that is coming. They may have to cut their dividends on their stocks. The stocks are plunging right now. And one source is saying they're looking at a loss of 6.2 billion euros, at least in part due to their exposure to Volkswagen. Another source is saying it's a $7.6 billion loss. This is a major, major hit, and we could see a cascading event begin, followed by a derivatives firestorm. It's going to start someplace. They can't hold this little fraud together much longer. All right, getting on back to the gun grabbers and how desperate the government is to get our guns away so that it's going to be easier for them to take our gold, our silver, and our sons and daughters for more wars of conquest to prove America's exceptionalism across the globe. Do you realize that the National Rifle Association is the only organization in America that's being blamed for actions none of its members actually commit? Guy melts his brain on prescription medication. Oh, it's the fault of the National Rifle Association. No, it isn't. National Rifle Association didn't give him the medication. In fact, the National Rifle Association is very concerned about the link between prescription psychiatric medication and these acts of violence. Now, Obama is preparing his executive orders for gun control, but remember, executive orders are legally binding only on the executive branch of the federal government. They have nothing to do with the states and with we the people. We're under no obligation to obey an executive order from the President of the United States. And under the United States Supreme Court decision Marbury versus Madison, any such orders or laws that are repugnant to the Constitution are automatically null and void. And again, the hypocrisy of the U.S. government wanting to disarm the American people at the same time they were shipping guns to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Mexican drug cartels. Obama's out there saying, oh, look at all these poor students killed by a gun in Oregon. What about all the people killed by U.S. weapons of war? We're talking millions. But that's just collateral damage, remember? Now, talking about police abuse, and this, unfortunately, is becoming a very typical story. Apparently, over in New York, there was this woman who woke up inside the Harlem Hospital psychiatric ward, and she was kept there for 8 days, forcibly medicated, lorazepam and lithium. They claimed she was bipolar and delusional because she claimed that she owned a BMW and was a banker, had President Obama as a follower on Twitter, and the police took her car. And they put her in the mental hospital when she asked for it back. And she's suing now because, as it turns out, this woman does own a BMW. She has worked at Citibank, Chase, and Astoria Bank. And this woman has no history of mental illness. The New York Police Department did steal her BMW, and yes, President Obama is a follower of hers on Twitter. Why was she treated like this? Well, she happens to be black. There we are. Now then, up in Canada, just for those of you north of the border who think that Israel's control of our government is our problem and not yours, we're coming up on the trial of Arthur Topham, who is being prosecuted under Canada's hate speech laws for criticizing the government of Israel. Israel has succeeded in coercing the government of Canada to make criticism of Israel's actions a jailable offense. Now, there is a provision for freedom of speech in the Canadian Charter of Rights. And all of these charters, or Bill of Rights, or declarations, give us freedom of speech to criticize the government. Certainly our own, first and foremost, but any other government on the planet. And yet Israel is out there literally bribing politicians, coercing them, blackmailing them, who knows, so that in the case of Israel, freedom of speech can't apply. because it's all anti-Semitism and it's Jew hate. This is like trying to defend the actions of Adolf Hitler by screaming, "You're just being anti-Aryan. Hitler didn't do anything wrong. The Nazis aren't misbehaving. You just hate the German people." That's literally how absurd this has become. And Canadians, and pretty much everybody else, need to make a big stink over this, because Arthur Topham is looking at time in jail for speaking his honest opinion about the behavior of Israel's government. And that is not anti-Semitism. We're talking about behavior. We're talking about actions. And we're talking about a very small group of politicians, the government of Israel. And Israel persists in hiding their crimes behind the shield of all the world's Jewish people, which makes targets of them in an eventual backlash. But Israel's government doesn't care about Jewish people any more than the U.S. government cares about those of us being stuck with these needles for the vaccines. It's the rise of tyranny and dictatorship, and Canadians ought to be furious that their right to their honest opinion is under threat from a foreign government. Now, there is a little bit of good news here. Because again, the fastest way to bring down a dictatorship is to force it to act like one where everybody can see it. And whether it's Israel's attempt to railroad Topham, AIPAC and Netanyahu's attempt to force the Congress to kill the Iran deal, or all of the dirty tricks now taking place on U.S. college campuses to silence the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, all of it indicates that Israel understands they've lost control over the minds of America. Americans are now seeing Israel, the government of Israel, for what it really is. And they're getting angry. You know, there's something going on with our educational system besides Common Core. We need to pay attention to it. Apparently there's a big stink at this high school. Let me scroll on down to this. Belfry High School in South Williamson, Kentucky. They're on a mandatory school lunch program. You're not allowed to bring your own lunch from home. You will eat what the school is going to serve you. And apparently the students found maggots in their baked potatoes and were served green, moldy meat. What is going on here? Are we trying to condition the next generation of Americans to be living on starvation rations? Is somebody making a huge amount of money charging for healthy school lunches and then serving up slop? Apparently at an Ohio high school, a sophomore there took his own life because apparently school officials accused him of smelling of pot during the homecoming dance. No pot was found, but they reported him. It goes on your permanent record. We think you were exposed to marijuana. And the kid's dead. Maybe he was on antidepressants. But when you're trying to play by the rules as a young person, and you get accused of something like that, it can be emotionally devastating. Now, down in Georgia, there was a lawsuit filed against this public school because teachers, this one teacher was telling a first grader his mom was evil for not believing in God. Mind you, this is a public school, not church, a public school. The teacher was telling this kid that his mother was evil for not believing in God. Oh, there's the music. All right, I'll save the rest of this for tomorrow. There's the music. Time for me to get on out of here, get something useful done with the rest of the day. We'll be back tomorrow here on the Genesis Communication Network. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, stay skeptical. Please, everywhere you go, post the question about Hillary, her email server, and her foundation. Was she selling secrets for donations? It's a question that must be asked and answered. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.